As you mentioned, my name is Dante Ledbetter. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager at Stash. And I want to talk about something that's extremely important, especially for these companies who are building a new product, and that's how to build a CRM and lifecycle strategy for your new product. Let's see. And I want to start off by saying that unless your product is naturally sticky and simple, that you will need a CRM and lifecycle strategy. So unless you have an app like Flappy Bird that's extremely simple, extremely addictive, extremely sticky, you will need some sort of engagement strategy for new users who are using your new product. And why is that your best bet? Number one, your product may be confusing. You may deny it, but your product may be confusing at first, especially your first iteration. Your customers may be overwhelmed or underwhelmed. So a lot of people may come to your app and they may be confused, overwhelmed with the amount of information, the amount of options that are in your app, or they may be underwhelmed and they may be bored. And your customers have other priorities. There are probably hundreds of apps on their phones. What's going to make your app stand out? What's going to make your app engaging and keep them coming back? And some behaviors just won't be natural. There's a lot we can do from a marketing perspective to incentivize behavior, to drive behavior. But for a lot of people, using your app won't be a natural thing for them. So there's a lot of work you have to do on researching why people don't use your app, researching and what will make people use your app. So the first thing you want to do is map your funnel to lifecycle stages. And it can look something like this. So I hope you all have some sort of North Star for your product. But what you do is you start with your North Star and work backwards. So obviously there are steps that users have to go through to get to your, ideal behavior. Rarely will you ever see users come into your app and just start doing everything. Maybe 15, 20% of your users will be great users out of the gate, but there are steps that users need to go through to get to your North Star. So for us, for example, Stash just launched a couple of months ago a new debit account. And obviously for us, we want people to swipe the card. We want people to start spending, to use the debit card. But there are a lot of steps before that people have to do to get to that point. For example, people have to fund their account. People have to actually receive their card, to activate their card, and turn on some other features to get the maximum benefit of the debit card. So what we do is we break the funnel in our lifecycle up into stages. So number one, once a user creates a debit account, we want them to immediately fund. That's number one. And we see a huge drop off in people not funding. So if you're not funding, you're definitely not going to get your card or start spending. So then once you fund, okay, we ship your card should be activated. A lot of people will see a drop off there. A lot of people won't activate their card for some reason. That's another impediment to the North Star. A user is definitely not going to spend if they don't activate their card. So we have to get them funded, activating cards, and then once that happens, we get them into the behavior and the habit of swiping the debit card. And that's how, obviously, we make money. So what you want to do is start with your North Star. Here's what I want. Here's the perfect scenario for our app. Here's the perfect behavior for our app. And how do I work backwards from there to sort of chop up those behaviors into KPIs, and then you can sort of build your lifecycle strategy from there. But when you start that, you want to sort of dig deeper into each stage. So you want to answer key customer-centric questions. So for your new customer experience, or some people call it onboarding, whatever you want to call it, the first thing you want to ask is, what information do people need to know to get started? As I mentioned, a lot of people may be underwhelmed, they may be overwhelmed, they don't know what to do, they just downloaded your app, maybe they saw an ad in social media. How do you get people started? What information do you surface to get people started? Is it a blog post? Is it in that message? Is it an onboarding experience within the app? There needs to be some information to get people started. Unless, as I mentioned, unless your app is really simple and pretty self-explanatory, unless you're playing tic-tac-toe, and we all know how to play that, I hope, people need some sort of information to get started. Then you want to ask, do we make it easy to get started? What are the roadblocks to registration? Sometimes for certain apps, registration can actually be a difficult thing, especially if you're dealing, with finance and people have to verify their identity. People get caught up in that. And that can be an impediment to the user experience. So you have to figure out a way to remove those roadblocks and make it as easy as possible to get started, as easy as possible to register, and just start using the app. And then do people understand the value prop? This is something that a lot of companies tend to forget. They think that they create a really easy app, really easy registration, and they think that it should be smooth sailing from there. But a lot of times, people will download your app and actually forget why they downloaded the app and actually won't really realize the value prop of your app and why they should be using it in the first place. So they will drop off. So even if you have an easy registration, you think you have all the content for your onboarding experience, but if you're not surfacing the right value prop for that user, they will drop off. So one thing that we did at Stash, as I mentioned, there are several steps that you have to go through to get the full benefit of the Stash debit account. One thing that we did is laid out next steps for a user. Because before this, we didn't really have any sort of clear roadmap, user roadmap in terms of getting started, what are the next steps. So we tested a screen in the app. So once a user opened an account, we told them what to do next. And that actually provided a 9% lift across all of our main KPIs. So funding, card activation, spending. And it was something so simple as showing a user what they should do next, but it was something that was easy to overlook. So remember those simple things that you can do to your experience to get people using your app. And then once you get to this sort of activation and ramp period, I'll sort of bundle activation and ramp into one thing. You want to start thinking about what behaviors are key to molding an active user. So what are the key behaviors that your best users start to exhibit early on that will indicate that they'll be a good user? So for example, let's say, for a Stash debit account, if a user comes on and they start depositing, let's say $500, we know that they'll probably be a pretty good user because if you have a lot of money in that debit account, you're probably going to spend it. But if you come on and you say you deposit $5, you can't really do much with $5. Maybe you can buy a pack of gum, maybe 5 packs of gum, but that's it. So you want to start looking at those key indicators of a good user and try to nudge your new users to exhibit those behaviors. And as I mentioned before, some of those behaviors will not be natural. So there's a lot you have to do with nudge messaging. There's a lot you have to do with content, incentivizing those behaviors. And then just think about the hurdles that are present, that you have to clear from the user experience to make people start exhibiting that behavior. And then you get to this, what I call nirvana, basically, which is your loyal users. And you have a lot of these users that are doing what you want them to do. They're driving most of your revenue. Maybe it's the 20% of users who are driving most of your revenue. You want to start thinking about, number one, how do I keep these users around? Because a lot of those users will actually stop using your app eventually if you're not continuously engaging them, if you're not continuously providing messaging improvements, product improvements. There will be a time where these users will actually stop. So how do you retain these users? What strategies, what regular cadence can you implement to sort of keep these users going? And then once I have that perfect user, how do I map out that perfect path that they took? And how do I replicate that for our new users? Not every user will take the same path, but if you can get pretty close to that perfect path, you'll be on the right track. And then to keep people engaged, you can do things like surprise and delight messaging, a lot of transactional messaging, feedback loops, behavior reinforcement, benefit reinforcement, just to show those perfect users that you didn't forget about them. You're not going to stop your messaging just because they're doing what you want them to do. But you remember them, you know their habits, you know their attributes. So you're going to surface personalized, regular messaging for that. So with all that said, V1 will not be good. I promise you it will not be good. It will never be good. So what do you do when V1 is not good enough? Obviously startups have the privilege of being fast and being lean, so you can iterate, and you can iterate pretty fast. When you get to this point, you want to address two questions. Number one, where's the void and where's the friction? So when we talk about void, we talk about things that are missing from the app or missing from the user experience. And then friction, as I mentioned before, what's impeding users from taking that next step? What's impeding users from exhibiting that North Star behavior? And there will be a lot of it. There will be a lot of holes. There will be a lot of like registration roadblocks, maybe activation roadblocks. Maybe your app doesn't even work at a certain point. Like there will be a lot of that, and you have to do your research to figure that out. But then what you want to do is test big ideas at friction points. So always be testing, always A/B test different ideas. One thing that we did at Stash is, so as I mentioned before, funding a debit account is a key KPI for Stash in terms of the debit account. But we find that a lot of people won't fund within a certain time frame. So one thing that we did is we sort of took a step back and thought about the user experience. And a lot of our messaging early on will be centered around nudge messaging, trying to convince someone to do something. But we had to take a step back and say, okay, what if someone is not ready to fund their account when they open it? How do we sort of take a step back, give people sort of a respect, and then get them to fund? So what we did is we actually gave a user what I call a reminder to fund. So instead of saying, hey, listen, fund now, we said, okay, we see you haven't funded. When do you want to fund? Do you want to fund tomorrow? Do you want to fund today? Maybe in 3 days? And by giving users that option, giving users that respect, we actually saw a 40% lift in deposits. So I think that validated the fact that a lot of people aren't really ready to convert. They're not ready to do what we want them to do. So by giving them that space, giving them that respect, but still being on top of that KPI, we were actually able to provide a significant lift in deposits. And then fill in the void. So this is sort of what it might look like. I call the void no man's land. So a lot of people will go through onboarding, but then maybe 70% of those users will drop off after onboarding, and they will fall into that first no man's land, and they will never come out. Maybe you get, with some re-engagement messaging, maybe you would get 20% of the users to come out of no man's land, go into activation period, and then fall into the next no man's land. But it's a constant battle getting users from point one all the way to nirvana. And you probably won't, you will never get all of your users there, obviously. You will at best probably get 40% of the users there, but you have to constantly test to get people there, because going from 20% of users being there to like 35% will make a big difference in revenue and long-term value. And you can use rescue nudges, you can use tutorials, in-app content, product enhancements. There are a slew of things that you can use to get people over no man's land and into nirvana. And then lastly, this is sort of a simple process, but this is a process that you want to always follow. Number one, once you have your MVP of your product, gather data and research about how people use your product, and then start filling the gaps, start adding more messaging, and then you launch V1 of your messaging strategy, and then gather data and research about that. You add, remove, you optimize, and you keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And over time, you'll see those wins start to stack up, and you will reach your KPIs eventually. Thank you.